Welcome to the Layman's Seminary. We're continuing our dispensational series, giving short answers, which is a review of videos that we've already done, or a preview or an overview of things to come if you want to go back and watch those videos. So with that being said, we'll begin. Now, this series that we've done is an introduction that digs down deeper. I've said that before, but I think it needs to be reiterated. We're doing the drill down technique, going deeper as we go. This is the short video series, answering particular questions you can check out. I suggest you begin there if you're new to this, and then once you watch that, then you can go back in and watch these. Now you notice that the short video series are taken from the first few videos in the longer series. So if you find yourself wanting to skip those longer ones, since you already have covered that content, or if you want to see it all together as a whole, then you have those options there. But this is a summary that I've made based on the content of previous videos, and I'm going ahead and read that, and we'll begin here. God runs the earth, his household, by distinct arrangements throughout human history. This relates to the overarching purpose of glory, with salvation being one of his glorious activities. Salvation is not primary because it did not exist prior to the fall, but fellowship, worship, and service did exist in the Trinity, the angelic realm, and in the garden before the fall occurred. God's self-disclosure that includes the cross is his glory. God is the glorious one that gets the glory for all his wise, just, perfect judgments upon nations and individuals in the past, present, and future. For now, we could say you are a dispensationalist if you view the glory of God as the overarching theme of God's plan and arrive at a clear and consistent distinction between Israel and the church through literal interpretation. If one mistakes salvation as the overarching theme, he is more likely to blur this distinction between Israel and the church. God clearly reveals himself as glorious through communicating clearly by his covenants, which show he is faithful to his distinct promises. It is fine if a person differs on the number of dispensations, but it is important to know how some people arrive at 7 dispensations for Bible study purposes. The elements of a dispensation are also important to keep in mind, especially how they emphasize his graciousness. Okay. Our very first video right here, the big idea of God's plan, we're dealing with what is the overarching theme of the Bible primarily. And here's the sermon version if you're interested in that. Right here, the elements of a dispensation is where we expanded. I think it was in the last video, or maybe it's this one. I'll check in a minute. The definition of dispensation we expanded in part 3 of the longer video. At part 4, we expanded on the glory of God. Part 5, we gave an economy illustration of the dispensation. I don't know where 6 went, but 7 is the characteristics of a dispensation. Okay, that's what we're going to be talking about here. And you notice a third person joined, and this is Josh, which you should know from other videos that we've done. At this particular time, this was in October 18th, 2020, and Josh, who's a good friend, someone I've been studying with, that is in seminary, and on the board of the Layman's Seminary and all that stuff. He was in Korea at this time, and my wife, of course, is in Hong Kong, and so we were studying. And this is, I think that is when Corona was still around. I don't know. I can't remember the timeline when it actually began. But now that he moves into the picture, what I'm going to be doing in the series is a method that I do whenever I teach the Bible in a group. The newcomer, I give them the most attention, or let me put it this way. The one that doesn't know as much or that is new to a particular field, I let them try to answer stuff first, And of course, you have to develop a relationship and get the person used to it or comfortable enough to answer the questions. And then, so the idea is that Janet will be answering questions first, and then Josh will answer after her. That's the plan. That doesn't always go that way because we're going to add more and more people as we go. Anyway, continuing on. All right, so here's 7. What are the elements of a dispensation? There's the question that we're asking there, right? And here's the answer. Now you have the difference is in this particular video where we're going through the elements, Ryrie made a distinction between primary elements and secondary elements. So he would say primary is an event and human responsibility. In other words, these things have to occur for a dispensation to occur. But the human test, the human failure, and the divine judgment, those are secondary. In addition, human failure can refer to the rule of life, in other words, how you live, and it can also relate to salvation, just depending on the context. And the divine judgments are climatic, they build up. Okay, so in the first video in the series, Introduction to Dispensation, that was the original title for them, but I shortened the title to just Dispensationalism, the big idea of God's plan. At the 1 minute mark of that video, I go into about a dispensation, what a dispensation is. But in the Dispensation 3 larger video, I actually expound on that definition. At the 3 minute mark of that very first video, the big idea of God's plan, we talk about the definition as it relates to a household illustration. And then at the 4 minute mark, we go into what shows up in the Dispensation 4 video, the glory of God. So the point is, we introduced a lot of things in the very first video, and then the other videos have just been building off of that. Okay. The 43 minute mark, you have the elements of a dispensation introduced in a big idea video. So these are questions that you've already encountered and we've answered in the previous video. So I'm just putting them here just to remind you. I'm not going to answer them right here. Well, I guess I am. I forgot that I included the answers because these are the screenshots from the original one. Okay, so what begins a new dispensation is a new responsibility, begins it at judgment, ends it as a rule of life. So here's the characteristics of a dispensation. This is the primary characteristics. So what marks off a dispensation? God changes the relationship of ruling in some type of way. God changes the human responsibility or corresponding revelation necessary to effect the change, which is new in its stage in the progress of revelation throughout the Bible. So the event is God changing how exactly he rules, through humans. The human responsibility, that's basically the same thing. And then how God changes how exactly he rules. And I'll try to explain what I mean by that. So right here, we could say innocence if we want to talk about the time before the fall. And we're going to evaluate these terms to see if there's better terms for this and all that later on. We could call that delegated direct rule. It's delegated because God gave it to man to rule, but God is directly there ruling, I guess you could say. And so the principal mode is like that. And then the event and human responsibility is maintain that direct fellowship with him. Okay. And how does he do that? By specifically caring for the garden, abstaining from eating the fruit. All right. And the human test is the satanic temptation, which related to the tree. Okay. So the delegated indirect rule through conscience, which is after the fall, is there's an event is judgment where new revelation is given, and there's a barrier placed between the Garden of Eden and what is outside, and that's with the angels and all of that. And it's also the sin barriers is there as well. The human responsibility, life after the fall, but before the flood. So just describing how life will be after the fall, before the flood. Now, we're going to actually go into more detail about these, but right now, I'm just inserting what Ryrie was saying when he was tracing this as it related to the human, the elements of a dispensation. All right. Then he says delegated indirect rule through government, but he doesn't go into detail about describing it. Delegated indirect rule through the promise or patriarchs, but he doesn't go into detail in describing it. Delegated indirect rule through the Mosaic law. And so you have the human responsibility, the Mosaic law. And so that assumes, well, what was before it, The human failure, there's minor and major distinctions here. You might want to use the word micro and macro. So the major failure would be the crucifixion of Christ. And that's what ended the dispensation. The minor failures are the times that occurred between there. There's more to be said about how exactly the dispensation ended or the law ended, and we'll deal with that later on in the future. Okay, so delegated indirect rule through grace or the church age. The event that's changed, or like an illustration, is when the veil was torn, even though the church didn't actually begin yet at that moment. He says the human responsibility is justification. I have a question mark here, and I'll talk about that later on. And then the human failure is major apostasy, falling into the ultimate falling away, and I know some of those passages may refer to the rapture, but I do believe there's other passages that deal with the actual apostasy, falling away from biblical doctrine. Okay, so this is what Ryrie says. Witness to the distinguishable difference in relation to justification as summarized by Paul in his sermon at Antioch of Pisidia. Through him, everyone who believes is freed or justified from all things, from which you could not be freed or justified through the law of Moses. Now, this passage is tricky, not for most people though, because they haven't made certain conclusions or preliminary conclusions that I have concerning justification. So this is one that we'll definitely revisit in the future, but I just want people to be aware of it because he's dealing with the issue of justification here. This too is obviously a distinctive stage in the progress of Revelation. Therefore, we conclude that a new dispensation was inaugurated since the economy and responsibility changed and the new revelation was given. So he's talking about distinction between the law. All right, secondary characteristics. The purpose for them relates to testing. So like in James 1, testing involves bringing out what is in people. In other words, whether they're faithful or whether they're going to fail. So testing is not so that God's doing scientific experiments because he doesn't know what's going to happen. It's dealing with revealing to the individual or to others around the individual the character of them, or to the angels even. The human responsibility is more general. The human test is specific. We'll see a partial statement about this concerning Schofield and this idea about sin coming to a climax ending the dispensation. Okay, so here we go into delegated direct rule through the millennial kingdom. The event is primary, the human responsibility is primary, the human test is secondary, human failure is secondary, rule of salvation related to that. But there's also the rebellion that occurs at the end of the millennium, Revelation 20:7-9, and then there's a divine judgment, which of course is secondary, and then of course the display of God's grace and attribute. If, however, there were no decisive tests, there still could be a dispensational arrangement. This is what he means by secondary. If there were no climatic failure and judgment, there still could be a change in the dispensational arrangement. So you might think of it like this. It's like you're playing a video game and you complete one level, then you can go to the next level. So there's still a change in the stage, even though you didn't fail. You level up, if you will. Since God has always been gracious, is it wrong to call one of the dispensations grace? We ask that question because some people think, oh, well, why would you say we're in the dispensation of grace? God's always been gracious. And that's why we highlight God's divine grace in the elements throughout the very beginning. And to answer that, you can think about this question. Since God has always been a God of law, which he has, he's always given commands. Is it wrong to call one of the dispensations law? And no, it's not, because scripture calls it law. So what God has done and him naming out a particular dispensation that is characterized by what he's doing, there's nothing wrong with that. John 1:17, for the law was given through Moses, Mosaic law. Grace and truth were realized, or came, some would say, through Jesus Christ. All right, so in this video, we're going through and we're talking about John 1:18 here and the context of that. You can go back and watch it. And then here in Acts 7, we're talking about how Jesus, as the angel appeared to him in a burning bush, called to him and said, I am the God of your fathers, Abraham and Isaac. So we're talking about the idea of John 1:18, that no one has ever seen God at any time, but the only begotten God or only begotten Son, depending on what translation or texture variant you take, can be involved. And so arguing for the idea that Jesus Christ has always been the mediator between God and man, not just at the cross. So in the eighth video, we continue talking about the characteristics, and we're actually going to go into that in this video. Thought it would be best to combine those two. Now, right here, Ryrie's using the illustration of cross-sectional and longitudinal. So he says cross-sectional perspective is the view usually presented in dispensational charts, how they're split up like that. Longitudinal includes the continuing principles through all dispensations that give coherency to the whole course of history. So this is discontinuity and this is continuity. So this is just in general, I think this is from sociology or whatever. Cross-sectional focuses on one point in time, and it has different samples. Okay, so different people living at different periods of time, and it's a snapshot. But longitudinal is several points of time, and it's following the same sample, changing the individual level. So those are things just keep in mind as we're going through this. This is the one that I made. Cross-sectional, any given point in time. Longitudinal focuses on the progress of revelation. Cross-sectional, the dispensation of Mosaic law. Longitudinal, God is always a God of law. Cross-sectional, God judges at certain points in time. Longitudinal, God is always just. Cross-sectional, the dispensation of grace. Longitudinal, God is always gracious. Okay, so this idea of continuity and discontinuity was primarily introduced in this book right here, which has people across the board, including dispensationalists, in it. It's a good book to study. I still am wrestling with some of the things in it over all these years, still working through it, but it's an older book still. I would put it on your reading list. I'm going to give a quote from Calvin. This is the particular one that I was using. I mean, I got other books by Calvin, but each one's translated differently, so I don't know much about which ones are best translated for Calvin or whatever. I'm not a 5-point Calvinist, but continuing on. It is not fitting, they say, this is the quote from Calvin's Institutes, that God, always self-consistent, should permit such a great change, disproving afterward what he has once commanded and commended. So he's saying that there's some people that say that God should never do something different because he's the same. And so this is what he replies. I reply that God ought not to be considered changeable merely because he accommodated diverse forms to different ages, as he knew would be expedient for each. Okay. Then he continues. If a farmer sets certain tasks for the household in the winter, other tasks for the summer, we should not on this account accuse him of inconstancy or think that he departs from the proper rule of agriculture, which accords with the continuous order of nature. So he's even using a household imagery here, right? Farmer, agricultural, sort of like the economy imagery. And look at here. In like manner, if a householder instructs rules and guides his children one way in infancy, another way in youth, and still another in young manhood, we shall not on this account call him fickle and say that he abandons his purpose. So even though Calvin is not dealing with the issue of dispensationalism, what he's saying here still applies. And I think that's important for those that are reformed that like Calvin, but don't like dispensationalism, should take into consideration. Why then do we brand God with the mark of inconstancy? Because he has with apt and fitting remark distinguished a diversity of times. Okay. Cross-sectional view emphasizes the distinct importance of each event in its historical setting and for its particular purpose. Longitudinal view places all events in their proper relationship in the total progress of revelation. Okay. Dispensationalism avoids confusion and contradiction, and at the same time unites all the parts into the whole. That's the claim of Ryrie about dispensationalism. Okay, some people think that when we're talking about the dispensations, that it's a cyclical view of history, that things are repeating, but actually not. It's a linear view because you have progressive revelation and progressive events moving toward a certain goal. Whenever you're talking about progressive revelation, it's an upward spiral. So you start here with innocence or whatever dispensation you believe is first, and then you move up. So you're receiving greater revelation. So you're not going in circles, you're getting additional information. A fresh divine beginning is never merely a return to the old. In each reformation born out of collapse lay at the same time the seed of life program for the future. Revelation and development are in no case opposites, but belong together in the sphere of the Bible. As elsewhere, there is an ascent from lower to higher, from twilight to clearlessness. And this is what Eric Saward said in the Dawn of World Redemption. He's talking about what he's seeing throughout Scripture. This spiral concept is readily seen by imagining the confusion of inverting the dispensation order and placing the millennium first. So he's basically saying the dispensations build on top of each other, that you couldn't place the millennium first because then you would have Jesus being the first Adam, and you couldn't go backwards, of course. Or you can't reverse law and grace, or whatever names you wish to attach to which came through Moses and that which revealed through Christ. Dispensation reveals the outworking of God's plan and the historical process in the progressive revelation of his glory. It magnifies the grace of God, for it recognizes the true progress can come only from God's gracious intervention in human society. If there were not cyclical interventions, so-called cyclical interventions, then the course of history would be only downward and entirely pessimistic. So it would be like this maelstrom or whirlpool where everything would be going downhill, being sucked down in that form of a spiral. To summarize, the principal characteristic of a dispensation is the economic arrangement and responsibility that God reveals in each dispensation. Such responsibility is a test in itself. Most men fail the test, and then judgment follows. The dispensational scheme has two perspectives: a cross-sectional aspect, which is sometimes misconstrued as cycles, but which is in reality a spiral, and a longitudinal aspect, which emphasizes the unfolding progress of revelation and continuing principles throughout the ages of the dispensations. And that's it. So we'll talk more about sine qua non next time. But if you've been blessed by this video, then hit the bell if you want notifications. Share this with others. Subscribe if you haven't already. Give us a thumbs up. But most of all, please keep this ministry in prayer. God bless.